I will leave my name anonymous, but I am a forensic doctor in New York City. I've worked for years in the morgue, seeing the worst that death has to offer. I got used to the stench of decomposition, the hollow sound of bodies hitting the metal slab, the feeling of opening cold, lifeless flesh. I thought nothing could shake me until that night when something changed my perception of death forever. It was almost midnight when they brought in a man who had been hit by a truck. His body was destroyed by the impact. Fractured skull, collapsed chest, dislocated limbs. His skin was pale, cyanotic, with deep cuts on his face. Nothing out of the ordinary for me. I signed the intake papers and had him transferred to the autopsy room. I had been on shift for too many hours, but my turn was not over yet. I put on my gloves, adjusted my mask, and prepared for the dissection. I turned on the recorder and began the Y incision on his chest. Everything was going fine, until, at the exact moment I cut, I heard something impossible. A whisper. "I'm not dead." I froze. It was a low, guttural murmur, but as clear as the sound of my own breath. My entire body tensed. I looked around the morgue, making sure I was alone. But I was. Alone with the corpse. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the sound of the scalpel against bone, maybe the air conditioning. But when I looked again at the man's face, my blood ran cold. His lips were trembling. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath and placed 2 fingers on his neck, searching for a pulse, even though I knew it was useless. His skin was cold as marble. I checked his reflexes, his pupils, any sign of life. Nothing. He was clinically dead. Hallucinations from exhaustion, I told myself, trying to be logical. But when I grabbed the rib shears to open his chest cavity, I heard it again. Clearer, louder. "I'm not dead." My hand shook, dropping the tool. I took a step back, feeling an icy pressure in my chest. This couldn't be real. But there it was, the lifeless body of that man, with lips barely parted, as if releasing that spectral voice. Fear clouded my reason, but logic forced me to continue. If there was even the slightest possibility that he was alive, I had to do something despite all the signs proving otherwise. I grabbed the defibrillator, placed the paddles on his chest, and delivered a shock. His body convulsed. I steadied my hands, gripping the scalpel more firmly, and opened the thoracic cavity. And that's when I saw something I will never forget. His heart was still beating. It was not a normal heartbeat. It was slow, erratic, impossible, but it was beating. I stepped back, chills running down my spine. This made no sense. I checked his file. He had been declared dead at the scene of the accident. No vital signs, rigor mortis setting in. How could his heart still function? A wave of dizziness hit me, a tightness in my chest I could not explain. And that's when I noticed something else, something that made me wish I had never opened that body. His eyes. Those eyes, which had been glassy, vacant, lifeless just minutes ago, were now staring at me. No, not just staring. They were seeing me. A primal terror seized me. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall, unable to look away from that corpse, a body that somehow still had something alive inside it. His chest barely lifted, as if he were trying to breathe. But he had no functional lungs, no trachea. This wasn't possible. And then, in the absolute silence of the morgue, I heard something else. A wet, sticky sound coming from inside his body. I held my breath and looked into his open chest cavity. I saw it, something black, viscous, writhing between his organs, impossible to describe. It was not flesh, not blood, not anything I had ever seen in a cadaver. It moved, slowly, like a parasite, searching for a host. And then, as if sensing my presence, it stopped. The silence became unbearable, until the corpse, the man who should not have been alive, opened his mouth. And with a voice that was not his own, with a voice that was not human, he whispered something else. Panic took over me. I don't remember exactly how I left the morgue. I don't know how I ran to the exit without collapsing, but when I finally stopped, breathless in the break room, I knew I would never be alone in that place again. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, they found the corpse lying on the autopsy table. Closed, as if no one had ever touched it. The forensic report was normal. Cause of death, severe trauma, nothing unusual. No one believed me. No one saw what I saw, but I know what happened. I know it wasn't a dream, and I know that night, something more than a body arrived at the morgue. Since then, I never work alone, because in this place, among the dead, there are things that should never wait. The first time I saw her body, I couldn't believe what I had in front of me. Not because it was grotesque. In this job, you get used to death. But because her skin was still smooth, her lips barely bruised, and her dark hair spread like a shadow over the metallic autopsy table. Her record stated she had been dead for 20 years. But if I hadn't read it with my own eyes, I would have sworn the girl had died only hours ago. I am a forensic doctor in New Orleans, and I have seen things that most people would rather not imagine. I've worked on bodies in advanced stages of decomposition, victims of violent deaths, but I had never encountered something like this before. A corpse that defied time itself. I reviewed the file with trembling hands. The girl had been buried 20 years ago, exhumed 3 times, and each time she was found back in the same grave. Those who discovered her swore that there were no signs that the ground had been disturbed, no evidence that she had been dug up. She was always just there, as if someone or something was putting her back in place, as if she had never left the earth. The autopsy room felt heavy. The sterile white light from the fluorescent tubes barely mitigated the oppressive atmosphere. I glanced at my assistant, a young man named Daniel, and even he looked uneasy. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said it all. No one wanted to be part of this. We washed our hands, put on our gloves, and began the procedure. As I made the first incision, the scalpel sliding effortlessly through her skin, a chill ran down my spine. Her flesh was unnaturally fresh. There were no signs of internal decomposition. Her organs were intact. Her thick, dark blood ran with an unnatural fluidity. I could hear Daniel holding his breath as I examined each part of her insides. None of it made sense. A corpse does not remain preserved this way for so long without special treatment. And yet this girl showed no signs of being embalmed. It was as if death had not finished claiming her. And then it happened. Her body trembled. This was not a post-mortem muscle spasm, not a reflex. It was a real tremor, a movement that rippled through her torso, as if something inside her was still trying to hold on to life. Daniel took a step back, his blood-stained gloves shaking. I froze. I looked at her face. Her lips were slightly parted, and then a faint sound escaped her mouth. A whisper. I couldn't understand what she was saying, if she was saying anything at all, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel the cold grip of death crawling over my skin. I stepped back, breathing heavily. This was impossible. It couldn't be real. I forced myself to rationalize. Maybe it was trapped air escaping her lungs. A post-mortem reaction. Yes, that had to be it. But deep down, deep in the part of my mind that still feared the unknown, I knew it wasn't. I made the decision. We had to finish the autopsy as quickly as possible. As we worked, a growing pressure filled the room, as if someone was watching us, as if we were not alone. The scalpels clashed against the metal tray. The sound echoed in the deathly silence. When we finished, we documented every finding. There was nothing medically explainable, no special pathology, no extraordinary condition, just a body that refused to accept its own death. We placed her in the refrigeration chamber and left the morgue. But there was something neither of us could shake off. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. It wasn't a terrifying face, but something about it disturbed me. There was an unnatural stillness to her expression, a calm that didn't belong to this world. I woke up multiple times with the overwhelming feeling that someone was in my room, watching me. The next morning, I returned to the morgue with one goal: to review her file one more time. But as soon as I arrived, I felt my stomach drop. The refrigeration chamber door was open. We hadn't left it that way. I looked at Daniel. His face was as pale as a corpse. We slowly approached the chamber. The tray was empty. The girl's body was gone. We searched the entire morgue. No one had entered without authorization. There were no records of any transfer. She had simply vanished, and then, hours later, the phone call came. They had found her, back in the same cemetery, in the same grave, wearing the same white dress, with her skin still untouched, as if the autopsy had never happened. That was the last time I ever got involved with her case. I didn't want to know more. I didn't ask if they would exhume her again. I didn't want to hear explanations, because deep down, I knew there were none. Some things cannot be explained with science. Some things simply are. Since that day, I avoid that cemetery, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. That whisper, that barely audible sound that left her lips that night in the morgue. A sound that was not the wind, not trapped air. A sound that, though I never understood, still haunts me in my dreams. I didn't know how to justify what had happened in my report. I wrote what any sane forensic doctor would have written. The body was removed without authorization under unknown circumstances. I did not add my suspicions. I did not mention the overwhelming feeling that something else was at play. I knew no one would believe me. Not even Daniel dared to discuss it, but deep down, we both understood. What we had witnessed was not a simple case of body theft. Days passed. I tried to convince myself to forget it all. But then, the dreams started. At first, just blurry images. I was in the morgue. The girl lay on the autopsy table, her face still, but in my dreams, her eyes were open, empty, dark. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the unbearable feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. Watching me, I could feel her presence in every corner of my house. I was not alone. And then, 1 week later, the news came. It was the final blow to my sanity. The girl had been exhumed. Again. A group of cemetery workers, digging near her grave for an unrelated excavation, found her, buried once more, untouched, as if she had never been moved. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my problem, but a part of me knew I couldn't escape. Not from something like this. So I went to the cemetery. I had to see her again. I arrived at sunset. The dying light cast long shadows over the graves, like claws reaching out from the earth. The workers had already left, but the groundskeeper let me in. He pointed to her grave and hurried away. He didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. He felt it too. Something was not right. The grave was open. I leaned over the edge, and there she was, exactly the same. The white dress, immaculate, her skin cold, but without decay, as if she had never died. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I wanted to step away, but then I heard it. The whisper, the same whisper I had heard in the morgue, a soft, breath-like sound, slipping from her lips. But this time, I understood it. Don't leave me. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled backward. A cold, unnatural presence wrapped around me. This wasn't real, but it was. She was speaking to me. I ran. I fled the cemetery without looking back. I don't remember how I got home, but the moment I shut my door behind me, I knew the truth. I couldn't escape, because she was already with me. The following days were a nightmare. I couldn't sleep. Every night I heard her voice in my room, whispering my name. I saw her, in the reflections of mirrors, in the shadows of hallways. She wouldn't let me go. Desperate, I began researching her past. I discovered that 20 years ago, she had died under strange circumstances. No one knew exactly what had happened. Her family buried her. But every few years, her body reappeared, as if she refused to stay underground, as if something or someone wouldn't let her rest. And then, I understood. She was not dead, or at least, not in the way we understand death. She was trapped, and I knew what I had to do. That night, I returned to the cemetery, with gasoline, with matches, with the determination to end this. If death would not claim her, I would do it myself. I opened the grave one last time, and I knew she was waiting for me. Her eyes were open. I lit the fire. Without hesitation, the wood of the coffin cracked. The flames danced like spirits around her body. And then she smiled. It was a sad smile. A smile of relief. The fire consumed everything. The flames rose, and with them, the whisper faded. Since that night, I have never seen her again. I have never heard her voice again. But sometimes, when I walk near the cemetery, I feel a strange sense of peace in the air, as if something or someone had finally found rest. It was the year 1998, in a small town in Louisiana, a place where beliefs and reality seemed to blend in unsettling ways. To me, death was no mystery. As a forensic doctor, I had seen dismembered bodies, victims of macabre rituals, and accidents that defied any logical explanation. But what happened that night in the morgue still haunts me. It all began when we received the body of a priest. His name was Father Stephen, a man known for his devotion, but also for whispers of heresy that spread among the parishioners. It was said that he performed strange rites in the church, that he murmured words in unknown tongues, and that in his final days, his gaze had become vacant, soulless. He died under circumstances that no one could explain, found kneeling before the altar, his hands clenched, and his skin marked with what appeared to be ancient symbols. We placed him on the autopsy table. His body was cold, rigid, but when I placed my hand on his chest, I felt something impossible. His heart was still warm. I stood motionless for a moment, trying to rationalize. Perhaps rigor mortis had not fully set in. Perhaps the blood had somehow been trapped in his thoracic cavity, retaining heat. But the sensation was not normal. It wasn't mere warmth. It was a deep heat, as if something inside him was still alive. My colleague, Dr. Franklin, approached and noticed it too. He quickly stepped back, his face showing something beyond mere confusion. "Don't open him," he whispered. I didn't understand his fear, but something in his tone made me hesitate. I ignored it. I took the scalpel and made the first incision on his chest. The moment the blade touched his skin, a dry, hollow moan echoed through the room, like a muffled lament that had no right to be there. I froze, the scalpel trembling in my hand, and for an instant I felt something watching me. Not Franklin, not a reflection, something deeper, something that resided inside the corpse. Then the surgical instruments on the table began to vibrate. At first it was barely perceptible, then stronger, until one of them fell to the floor with a sharp clang. A black liquid began to seep from the priest's eyes. It wasn't blood. It wasn't any normal post-mortem fluid. It was thick, oily, with a rancid, suffocating stench. I jumped back. Franklin murmured a prayer under his breath. "Stop," he insisted, his face completely pale. But I was already too deep into the autopsy, driven by the need to understand, to not be defeated by absurd superstitions. So I ignored the instinct screaming inside me. I cut deeper. The skin gave way easily, exposing the thoracic cavity. And that's when I saw it. The priest's heart was not just warm, it was beating. Not with the force of life, but with a slow, erratic rhythm, like a drum struck by a weak but persistent hand. My breath caught. This was impossible. The man had been dead for over 12 hours. I stepped back, but then the corpse moved. Not a post-mortem spasm, not a nervous contraction, something deliberate. His fingers twitched. The air in the morgue grew thick, oppressive, as if the very room was breathing. The black liquid dripping from his eyes spread across the table, forming irregular lines, lines that resembled something incomprehensible. Franklin ran. I knew I should have done the same, but I didn't. Something kept me there, an invisible force. I looked at the heart again. It was beating faster. I felt a pressure in my chest, an unexplainable weight. And then the priest opened his mouth. It wasn't a reflex. His jaw unhinged at an impossible angle, his throat a bottomless pit, and from his mouth came a sound that did not belong to this world, not a scream, not a whisper, a deep echo, heavy with infinite sorrow. My vision blurred. The room seemed to shrink. Invisible hands clenched around my throat. I felt myself being pulled, dragged towards something I could not comprehend. Toward a void, cold and burning at the same time. I don't know how I found the strength to move. Maybe it was pure survival instinct. Maybe it was Franklin's warning echoing in my head. I staggered away from the table. I tripped over the door, and I ran. I never looked back. That night, the morgue remained closed. We didn't return until morning, when the sunlight filled the room with its comforting warmth. But the priest's body was gone. The autopsy table was empty. Only dark stains remained on the floor, and an indescribable sense of emptiness. We never found out what happened to the body. The church refused to give explanations. And shortly after, the building we worked in was shut down. No reason was given. Since that night, I have never performed an autopsy alone again. But the worst part, on the quietest nights, when the world is shrouded in darkness, I can still hear it. That heartbeat, steady, erratic, waiting. I've been a forensic doctor for over 30 years. I've seen horrors that most people could never imagine. Mutilated bodies, charred remains, bones that tell stories of unimaginable violence. And yet nothing prepared me for that night in 1987 in Detroit. Nothing prepared me for that body, or for what happened afterward. He was a homeless man, unidentified, around 50 years old. But his hardened skin and extreme thinness made him look much older. He died of starvation. His body was just skin stretched over bones. But the most disturbing thing was what I found when I opened his stomach. There, among the acidic remains of an incomplete digestion, was something that should not have been there. Human flesh. Fibrous pieces, partially digested, mixed with bile and other fluids. I took a sample to the lab without saying anything. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But deep down, I already knew what I had seen. That night, as I wrote my report, the morgue was completely silent. Only the distant buzz of fluorescent lamps and the drip of a leaking faucet accompanied me. I had been working for hours. The smell of The homeless man's body lay on the metallic table, covered with a white sheet. Everything seemed in order, until I looked at his face. His lips had been bitten, not cut with a scalpel, not lacerated in an accident. There were teeth marks, his own. Small pieces were missing, as if he had eaten himself after death. A tightness crushed my chest. A primal terror I could not justify with logic. I approached slowly, my breathing shaky, my hands cold and sweaty. I touched his jaw, examining his teeth. Tiny bits of flesh still clung between them. This wasn't possible. It shouldn't be possible. His body was stiff. There were no signs of manipulation after the autopsy. I stared at his closed eyes, feeling an oppressive presence in the room. Something was wrong. I turned off the light and went back to my office, telling myself I would check again. The hours passed. Outside, the night grew darker. I couldn't shake the image of flesh between his teeth. And then a thought crossed my mind. What if he hadn't been dead when they brought him in? But I had checked. No vital signs, no reflexes, no brain activity. He had been dead. No doubt about it. I stood up abruptly, my skin prickling with unease. Something moved in the hallway, a soft sound, a brush against the floor. I forced myself to be rational, the pipes creaking, a draft moving debris, but I didn't believe it. Summoning my courage, I walked back to the autopsy room. The light flickered when I turned it on. The corpse was still there, unmoving. But something was different. The sheet covering him had shifted. A few seconds of hesitation held me frozen. Then I stepped forward and pulled the sheet back. My heart stopped. His mouth was open, his teeth covered in blood, and on his cheek near his chin was a fresh bite mark. But the worst part wasn't the bite. The worst part was that the wound was fresh. I stumbled backward, the air growing thick, suffocating. There was no way anyone had entered the morgue. There was no way he could have done it himself. But the evidence was right there. Then I heard it again. The growl, louder, closer. I turned slowly, paralyzed with fear. The hallway was dark, but something was moving in it. Something that shouldn't be moving. The temperature dropped instantly. A putrid stench filled the air, heavier than death itself. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, a soft sound, the dragging of something heavy against the floor. My heart pounded in my ears. And then, I saw it. A shadow, but not just a shadow. Something darker. It stood in the doorway. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me, and in that instant I understood. The hunger of that man had not died with him. I forced myself to step back, slowly, carefully. My trembling hand reached for the autopsy room door. With a single desperate motion, I locked it. Silence. Only my ragged breathing filled the air. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, convincing myself that it had been exhaustion, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, a thud, a heavy, dull impact from the other side of the door. And then another, and another. Something was scratching the wood, something that should not be there. I held my breath. The scratching stopped. And then, a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but clear enough for me to hear. I'm hungry. Terror took hold of me. I stood there paralyzed, hoping it was a nightmare, hoping I would wake up, but when the silence returned, I knew I would never forget. Because that night, something had awakened in the morgue. Something that should never have existed. As the first rays of sunlight seeped through the morgue windows, I finally mustered the courage to unlock the door. The room was silent. Nothing stirred. The air was thick with the lingering scent of chemicals, death, and something far worse. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped inside, my breath held, my body rigid with anticipation. I turned my gaze toward the autopsy table, and there he was, the homeless man, still lying beneath the white sheet, his body unmoving. Everything appeared normal. Everything, except for one thing. There were bite marks on his tongue. I stood, frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. The wounds were fresh, as if he had tried to feed on himself even after death. The thought made my stomach turn, a sickening wave of dread rolling through me. This couldn't be real. It shouldn't be real. And yet, there it was, undeniable. I rushed to complete the documentation, ensuring the body would be removed as soon as possible. I didn't want it spending another night in the morgue. By noon, the corpse was transported to the crematorium. I watched as the workers lifted it onto the steel gurney, wheeling it toward the incinerator. A strange sense of relief washed over me when the heavy door closed and the flames began their work. It was over. Whatever had been lurking in that body, whatever hunger had remained, would be reduced to ash. But the relief was fleeting. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt it again. That same suffocating pressure on my chest. That feeling of being watched. The room was silent, but then a sound cut through the still. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I slowly opened my eyes, my heart hammering violently. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the street lamp outside. But in the farthest corner, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. It was something else. A low, rough whisper slithered through the air, creeping into my ear like an icy breath. "I'm hungry." Panic took over. I lunged for the lamp, my hands trembling as I switched it on. The room flooded with light. Nothing in the corner, nothing by the door, nothing under the bed. But the air smelled different. It smelled of burnt flesh, of death. Insomnia became my only companion in the nights that followed. I tried to go about my work, to push the memories aside, but the feeling never left me, the sense that I was never truly alone. I started avoiding autopsies at night, always ensuring I left before the last shift ended, but the hunger never disappeared. A week later, I heard the whisper again, this time in the morgue. It was just before dawn, and I was finishing up some paperwork when the temperature dropped suddenly. The lights flickered, a cold shudder ran down my spine. I lifted my head, and from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway. Its outline was blurry, more shadow than substance, darker than the darkness around it. But the worst part wasn't the sight of it. The worst part was where the voice came from, not from the door, from behind me. I could feel it, so close, its breath cold against my neck. "I'm hungry." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I bolted. My chair toppled over as I sprinted for the exit, crashing into the metal table, knocking over instruments. I didn't care. I ran until I was outside, bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights. Technicians claimed they heard footsteps in the halls when no one else was there. Security guards quit after seeing shadows moving in the morgue. Some workers swore that upon checking the cadavers in the morning, they would find them with their mouths slightly open, bite marks on their own tongues. I never told my story. I never went back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is silent, I feel it. That same crushing weight on my chest, that same suffocating cold in the air, and every so often I hear a whisper crawling through the darkness. "I'm hungry." I'm a forensic doctor. My job is not for the weak, I know that. I have opened shattered bodies, examined charred remains, and smelled death in its worst forms. But there are things that neither logic nor science can explain, things that should not be. This happened in 1998, in a small town in Illinois. A winter night. We received the body of a young girl, 8, maybe 9 years old. Her skin was pale and cold, her abdomen swollen, deformed. The morgue was freezing, filled with that chemical and death-laced smell that clings to clothes and skin. But that night, I felt something else, something that made me hesitate. The police report stated she had been found alone in an abandoned house. No visible wounds, only that unnatural swelling. As I prepared her for the autopsy, a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I glanced around. Nothing. Only my reflection in the steel cabinets. But the feeling persisted. I made the first incision on her abdomen. The skin gave way easily, the blood already coagulated. I carefully separated the tissues, moved the organs aside, and there it was, something that had no right to be there, something that made me hold my breath. A small porcelain doll wrapped inside her intestines as if she had swallowed it. But that was impossible. There were no tears in her esophagus, no damage to her trachea. I pulled the doll out with trembling hands. Its face was horrifying, its eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror, its mouth deformed as if screaming in agony. A loud knock on the door startled me. I turned sharply. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My colleague Michael was in the other room. I took a deep breath and looked at the doll again. It couldn't be real. It couldn't have come from the girl's body. But it had, and that's when I knew something was wrong. I grabbed the scalpel and returned to the... Or so I thought. The overhead light flickered, a single flash, then a sound, a faint creaking like an old toy. My skin prickled. I looked at the doll. Its eyes seemed different, as if now they were watching me. I forced myself to continue. Something in her throat caught my attention. I took forceps and extracted an object, a small yellowed piece of paper. I unfolded it. 3 words written in red ink. She's not dead. The air grew heavy. The cold, more piercing, a crushing weight on my chest. I felt like I shouldn't be there, like I should run, but I didn't. The monitor turned on by itself, a sharp, irregular beep. The lights flickered, faster, and then I saw it. The girl, or what remained of her, moved. A slight spasm. Then her fingers curled, stiff, unnatural. My breathing became erratic. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. I stepped back, but my legs felt heavy. The autopsy table creaked. Her head turned slowly. Her open eyes locked onto mine. She wasn't dead. Panic gripped me. My instincts screamed to run, but I was trapped in the moment, frozen. I saw her chest rise barely, as if she was trying to breathe. Her mouth opened, her cracked lips parted, but she made no sound, only a dry click like a broken throat trying to speak. And then the doll fell to the floor. It didn't break. It didn't move, but its shadow did. Michael walked in at that moment, his brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to warn him. But when I looked at the autopsy table, the girl was still again, lifeless, dead, as she should be. The doll remained on the floor, its expression of horror unchanged. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I returned to the morgue, determined to understand. But the table was empty. The girl was gone. The doll was gone. We searched the records. There was no report of her intake, no body, no autopsy, nothing in the files, as if she had never existed. But I know what I saw. And every night when the lights go out and silence fills the morgue, I still hear it. That creaking, that echo of something that is neither alive nor dead. I never spoke about what happened in the morgue. There was no evidence. No one would believe me, but something inside me told me this wasn't over. I tried to convince myself it had been my mind playing tricks on me, exhaustion, suggestion. But the nights became unbearable. At first, it was just nightmares. The girl standing by my bed, her vacant eyes locked on me, her mouth open in a silent scream. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, with the suffocating feeling that something was watching me in the dark. Then the noises started. A faint creaking in my apartment when everything was silent, like an old toy shifting, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, objects misplaced. tiny details anyone else might ignore, but they became impossible to dismiss. Until one night I saw her, not in a dream. She was standing in the hallway of my apartment, pale, dirty, wearing the same dress she had when she arrived at the morgue. Her bare feet left damp prints on the floor. She stood motionless, her head slightly tilted, her dark hair partially covering her face. My heart pounded, I couldn't move, and then she spoke. "She's not dead." Her voice was weak, a dry, broken whisper. I blinked, and she was gone. But the doll was there, lying on the floor of my apartment, its mouth frozen in that same expression of horror. I forced myself to pick it up, my hands trembling. A knot tightened in my stomach. Its eyes, once a dull blue, were now dark, almost black. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my keys, got into my car, and drove out of the city. The doll sat in the passenger seat. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I didn't turn on the radio. I couldn't bear the silence or the static that sometimes broke through from nowhere. I drove until I reached the outskirts of town, an abandoned lot, the same place where, according to the report, they had found the girl. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. The ruins of the house still stood like a forgotten skeleton. Something felt wrong. The air was heavy, as if the place itself was rejecting me. I stepped inside. The wooden planks creaked under my feet. I had no plan. I just knew I had to return the doll to this place. I set it down on the floor and took a step back. "If you belong here, stay here." A whisper, children's voices, distorted. A shiver crawled down my spine. I turned slowly. The doll was gone. Panic hit me like ice. I rushed back to my car, my heart pounding. The engine wouldn't start. The dashboard lights flickered. The air turned freezing inside the car. My reflection in the rearview mirror was blurry, like it wasn't entirely mine. Something was behind me. The glass fogged up, as if someone was breathing just inches away. Slowly, stomach twisted in terror, I turned my head. She was there, sitting in the back seat, pale, silent, her mouth twisted in an impossible grimace, her greyish skin watching me. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. Then she lifted her hand, slowly, and placed it on my shoulder. A cold unlike anything I had ever felt surged through me. My vision blurred. My body grew heavy. Everything faded to black. I woke up. Not in my apartment, not in my car. I woke up in the morgue. Not just any morgue. The same morgue where it all began. The lights flickered. The air smelled of formaldehyde and death. I sat up, disoriented, and then I saw her lying on the autopsy table. A horrific, inhuman wail. I clamped my hands over my ears, stumbling backward, but the sound filled the morgue, dug into my skull. The glass cabinets rattled. The lights burst. Darkness swallowed me, and then silence. I gasped for air, struggling to my feet. The morgue was still. Everything seemed normal, but I wasn't. I could feel her presence. I turned to the autopsy table. Empty. The girl was gone. But the doll was still there, lying on the table, its mouth frozen in terror, and in my chest, a new feeling. A certainty that chilled my blood. I wasn't dead, but something inside me was. And I'm 42 years old and work at the Judicial Morgue in Chicago. I'm not an easily shaken man. I've seen bodies in conditions I wish I could forget, dismembered, burned, bloated after days floating in the river. I've smelled the sour stench of death clinging to my skin. I've opened corpses so rotted inside that words cannot describe it. Death is my routine, a constant presence I learned to face without fear or disgust. But there was one night, just one, when something inside me broke. He arrived like any other body, a 7-year-old boy, hit by a car at a pedestrian crossing downtown. His name was Ethan, according to the tag on his small foot. At first glance, he seemed to have died instantly. There were no signs of suffering. His expression was peaceful. But when I approached to examine him, something made me stop. He was smiling. Not just a post-mortem reflex. I've seen those spasms before, stiff lips pulled tight by rigor mortis. This was different. His lips were barely curved. As if in his last moment, he had found something amusing. I stared at him for a long time, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe his jaw had locked that way from the impact, even though that made no sense. Severe trauma usually disfigures the face, not leave it looking so serene. Night fell quickly, as it always does in that windowless basement. The stagnant cold of the morgue settled into my bones. I was used to it, but that night I felt uneasy. I reviewed the boy's file. Severe skull fracture, massive internal bleeding, died instantly. I closed the report and turned toward the gurney where I had left him. His smile looked wider. A chill ran down my spine. No, it couldn't be. It was the same smile I had seen before. I stepped closer, forcing myself to relax. It had to be my imagination. I closed my eyes for a second, rubbing my temples. When I opened them again, I swear on my life, I saw a slight change in his face. His lips had stretched just a little more. I couldn't keep looking at him. I turned away, trying to ignore the shiver creeping up my back. I forced myself to focus on other bodies, other reports. But the silence of the morgue became unbearable. Something felt wrong. An invisible presence pressed against the air. I don't know how much time passed. Night shifts in the morgue move in strange rhythms, where hours seem to dissolve into darkness. At some point, a draft swept through the hallway. Weak, but enough to make the curtains shift slightly. A knot formed in my stomach. The air in the morgue grew heavier. Each heartbeat felt like a hammer against my ribs. I stepped closer, a deep, irrational fear growing inside me. I placed my hands on his head, trying to straighten it. His skin was colder than normal. And in that moment, I felt it. A subtle pressure. A faint movement beneath my fingers. A spasm, a contraction, a sign of life where there should be none. A wave of terror shot through my veins. I snatched my hand away. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. The dead don't move. Not like this. I backed away, unable to tear my eyes away from his face. His smile. It had grown wider. This wasn't a child's smile anymore. It was twisted. It was wrong. It did not belong to this world. I ran for the door. I stopped just before leaving. I couldn't leave him like that. Not like this. I took a deep breath and returned. I covered his face with a sheet, as if that could erase what I had seen. But before I pulled the cloth completely over him, I realized I had made a mistake. His eyes, they had been closed before. Now they were open, black, empty. I didn't scream, but my mind did. I ran out of the morgue, leaving everything behind. I climbed the stairs so fast I nearly tripped. That same night, I requested a shift change. I never went back to the basement. I didn't want to know what they did with the boy's body. The next day, a colleague asked why I had switched shifts so suddenly. I had no answer, but before he could press me, an older forensic doctor joined the conversation. Another one who couldn't handle the morgue. At night, he gave me a strange smile. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged, and in the most casual tone in the world, he said, "You're not the first to request a transfer after spending a night with a dead kid." I never asked again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes in the darkness, I swear I can still see his smile. And deep down, I know he remembers me too. I didn't return to the morgue for weeks. They reassigned me to another shift, far from the basement where it all happened. I tried to go back to my routine, convincing myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, the stress of years working with death. But the memory of that smile clung to my mind like a parasite, sucking away my peace. The nights became difficult. Sleep barely came, and when it did, I saw him. Sometimes it was just a fleeting glimpse in the darkness of my room. Other times I could feel him standing in the corner, watching me. I never saw him move, but his presence was a shadow pressing against my thoughts. Then the noises started. At first it was just soft knocks on my apartment door, always around 3 a.m. I assumed it was a drunk neighbor or the wind rattling something loose outside. But when I checked, there was no one there. Then the knocking moved inside. The creaking of wood in the hallway, a faint metallic clinking in the kitchen, as if someone was moving the silverware in the dark. One night, I woke up gasping. Something was pressing on my chest. I couldn't move. Terror stabbed into my ribs like a knife. I forced my eyes open, and I saw him sitting on top of me, the boy. His small frame weighed more than it should. His face, just inches from mine. His eyes open, empty, hollow, like tunnels leading into endless blackness. And his smile. God, that smile. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. His cold little hand rested against my cheek, stroking me with a grotesque tenderness. Then he opened his mouth. A sound crawled from his throat, but it wasn't a human voice. It was a guttural murmur, a drowned whisper, as if he were speaking from some distant, suffocating place. I didn't understand the words, but I understood their meaning in my blood. You remember me. Now I remember you. I don't know how I managed to move. It was a spasm, pure instinct. I jerked upright, and the boy vanished, dissolving into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I knew I had to go back to the morgue. Something wasn't finished. The basement was as cold as ever, but that night the air was heavier. It felt alive, like the morgue itself was breathing. I dug through the records. I needed to know what had happened to Ethan's body. They had buried him 3 days after his death. No deep autopsy. A quick funeral. Too quick. The feeling that something was wrong slammed into my chest. And then something fell behind me. I turned slowly. A toe tag lay on the ground. I bent down to pick it up. There was no name, only a date. The date of my death. A cold, unlike anything I had ever felt, slid down my spine. I turned, and I saw him. At the end of the hallway, standing between the metal shelves, Ethan, his head tilted slightly, his smile stretched wide. Panic paralyzed me. I couldn't move. He took a step forward. And in that moment, I understood. He didn't want to scare me. He wanted me to remember. He wanted me to carry him with me, to make him a part of me, and in that moment I knew he would never leave me, that I would see his smile in every shadow, that when I died he would be waiting for me, with open arms, smiling. It was 2005 in New Orleans. I worked as a forensic doctor at the city morgue, a place where silence felt heavier than death itself. People think that after years surrounded by corpses you get used to it. You don't. Some bodies just won't let you rest. That day, they brought in the body of a young woman. She had been found in a hotel room downtown. The receptionist had called emergency services when no one responded to housekeeping. When the officers entered, they found her lying on the bed, dressed as a bride. Her veil carefully placed over her face, preliminary cause of death, asphyxiation. But there were no signs of struggle, no marks on her neck, no traces of poison. She had been found with her hands crossed over her chest, as if someone had carefully laid her there. When we unzipped the body bag, a strange coldness swept through the room. It wasn't the usual cold of the morgue. It was something denser. The woman was immaculate. Her white dress had no wrinkles, as if she was still waiting for her big day. My assistant, a young and eager trainee, was in charge of removing her veil. The moment he did, he gasped, "She's crying." I gave him a skeptical look until I saw it myself. Thin, wet streaks ran down her pale cheeks. It couldn't be sweat. Not on a lifeless body. I stepped closer, searching for a logical explanation. But what disturbed me wasn't the tears. It was her mouth. Her lips were slightly curved upward, in a rigid, unnatural smile, as if death had caught her in the middle of laughter. I gently tried to open her mouth and felt something crunch beneath my fingers. As I examined her further, the reality sank in. All her teeth were shattered. Not one, not two, every single one, as if she had clenched her jaw with impossible force. Until they crumbled, the air in the room grew unbearably heavy. My assistant took a step back, murmuring a prayer I couldn't understand. But I forced myself to continue. Science has no place for superstition. The autopsy itself was baffling. There were no signs of violence, no poison in her system. Her lungs had collapsed, as if she had stopped breathing out of sheer terror. Her heart, though still, showed signs of cardiac arrest, triggered by a massive surge of adrenaline, as if, in the last moments of her life, she had experienced unimaginable fear. But the strangest part came after. When we finished the examination and left her on the steel table, preparing for facial reconstruction, her smile was gone. Her lips were now completely neutral. I could have sworn we left her with that eerie expression, but there she was, her face serene, no trace of that sinister grin. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't say anything. Neither did my assistant. We just wanted to finish this as soon as possible. That night, as I filed the autopsy report, I found myself alone in the office. I'm not a paranoid person, but something pushed me to check the autopsy photos. When I opened the file on my computer, my breath stopped. In the first images, her expression was exactly as I remembered, that disturbing, broken smile. But in the last photos, her mouth was shut. This couldn't be a mistake. I checked the earlier photos again. and in all of them, she was smiling. Only in the last few, her expression had changed, as if she had closed her mouth on her own. I shut the file, my stomach twisting. I glanced at the gurney where her covered body lay. The air in the morgue was thick, heavy with a sickly scent. Not just chemicals, something rancid, something sweet like rotting flowers. I stood up, making an excuse to get coffee and clear my head. But when I returned, something had changed, subtle, but enough to send chills through my skin. The sheet. It wasn't the way I had left it. Before, it covered her completely. Now, the fabric had shifted just a few inches, revealing her mouth. And in the dim light of the room, I swear, she was smiling again. I stood frozen. No, it wasn't possible. I approached cautiously, each heartbeat pounding like a drum in my chest. With terrifying slowness, I lifted the sheet completely. Her lips were split, as if someone had forced a smile onto her lifeless face. I stumbled back, my breath unsteady. Then a feeling crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence, something that did not belong to the world of the living. The cold became unbearable. Something brushed against my back. A whisper, just barely audible, slipped through the air, like fabric dragging across the floor. I ran. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't file the papers. I didn't lock the morgue. I just left, leaving everything behind. The next day, I learned something even more disturbing. The woman, the bride with no wedding, had been missing for 2 weeks. Her fiancé had never been found. No one knew how she got to the hotel. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, not just the image from the morgue. Something worse. I saw her in the hotel room, sitting on the bed, her wedding dress pristine, her vacant gaze staring at nothing, her hands trembling in her lap, her knuckles pale, and her lips curving wider and wider. I couldn't get it out of my head. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, overwork. But then, the noises started. At first, it was small things, whispers in the morgue hallways. When I knew I was alone, soft footsteps on the tiled floor, when all the bodies were still. My assistant noticed it too, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. It was as if speaking about it would make it real. Then something happened that we couldn't ignore. One night, while we were filing reports, a sharp noise echoed from the refrigeration room. A thud, like something hitting the metal door from the inside. We froze. "It's probably just a cooling system malfunction," I tried to say. But my voice sounded hollow, unconvincing. Then another thud, louder. The lights flickered. The air turned icy, colder than normal. I forced my feet to move. I already knew what I would find, but I had to see it. Inside, the gurneys were all in place. The bodies lay covered in white sheets, except for one. Her. The sheet had slipped down, revealing half of her torso. Her hands, which we had placed on her chest, were now at her sides. But the worst part, her face. Her jaw was unhinged, her broken teeth visible, and what froze my blood solid, her lips were wet, not dried and stiff from death, but moist, as if she had been trying to speak. My assistant let out a strangled gasp, covering his mouth. Then the scent returned, That sickly sweet perfume, wilted flowers. Something moved, not a body, not a shadow, something in the air, something just beyond sight. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the morgue exit. Outside, the cold night air felt unreal, as if the world itself had shifted. We didn't go back inside until morning. When the supervisor checked the morgue, everything was normal. The sheet was back in place. Her hands were folded neatly again. No sign that anything had happened. But we knew. I requested immediate burial. I didn't want her spending another night there. The family agreed without hesitation. No one claimed her body. No close relatives came forward. The ceremony was small. After the casket was lowered into the ground, I stayed behind. I had to know. I approached the freshly placed headstone, ran my hand over the cold stone. "Who were you?" I whispered. The wind stirred, soft but sharp. There was no answer. I turned to leave, and then behind me, a sound, a faint brittle crack like teeth clenching together, like a smile forming. In the darkness. The sound of the wind rattling the old morgue windows accompanied me every night as I worked. My name is Michael Graves, and I am a forensic doctor in Charleston, South Carolina. Recently, the morgue where I work was renovated. The century-old structure had received modern upgrades, new equipment, better organization. But despite these improvements, something dark seemed to have awakened with the renovation. From the very first day I returned to work, I noticed an oppressive atmosphere, a presence in the air that I couldn't explain. It felt as if the old walls held secrets that did not want to be uncovered. The morgue, with its colonial architecture and long, shadowy hallways, had always had an air of mystery. But now, there was something more, something that made me feel watched. The first nights were relatively normal. The new equipment worked perfectly, and the job continued as usual. But soon, strange things began to happen, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, indistinct whispers filling the air whenever I was alone, and a constant nagging feeling that something was wrong. I remember one night in particular. I was working on a difficult case, the body of a man found floating near the docks. The condition of the corpse required detailed analysis, and I was completely absorbed in my work. Like someone had opened a door to winter in the middle of a humid summer night. I looked up and saw a shadow move quickly down the hall. I thought it was my assistant, but when I called his name, no one answered. When I went to check, the hallway was empty. As the days passed, the phenomena intensified. I began to hear footsteps behind me, even though I knew I was alone. The lights flickered for no reason, and often I found my tools moved. The situation escalated to its breaking point. One night, when I was finishing an autopsy, the whispers became clearer. I couldn't understand the words, but their tone was undeniably threatening. I decided to investigate the morgue's history, hoping to find a rational explanation. What I discovered was far worse than I expected. The morgue was built in the late 1800s and had once served as a hospital. For decades, rumors spread of dark practices taking place beneath its foundation. Stories of rituals and sacrifices carried out by a secret group operating in secrecy. The basement, now sealed off, had always had a sinister reputation. I made a dangerous decision. I had to see it for myself. Armed with a flashlight and my determination, I descended the stairs into the basement. With each step, the air became colder, thicker. The silence was suffocating. The basement was filled with old medical equipment, dust-covered boxes, and remnants of what once were furniture and tools. But what caught my attention most were the marks on the walls, strange symbols faded by time but still visible. A palpable aura of malevolence hung in the air. As I inspected the space, I felt it. I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to move on their own. The whispers grew louder, and I realized I was standing at the heart of something ancient, something evil, something that had awakened. The following days were a nightmare. The paranormal activity didn't stop. It got worse. The whispers became voices. The shadows no longer just moved. They lingered. I began having nightmares, vivid, horrible dreams. I saw rituals in the basement. I saw distorted faces twisted in agony. I heard screams, sobs, and even after waking up, the voices followed me. I finally confided in Laura, my assistant, the only person I trusted. She had noticed strange things too, but not as intensely as I had. Together, we started digging deeper, searching for any clue that could explain or even stop what was happening. We discovered that the morgue had once been a site for rituals performed by a group called the Order of the Black Blood. They operated in the early 1900s, obsessed with achieving immortality through human sacrifice. The basement had been their altar. Many disappearances were linked to the morgue, but those bodies were never found. With this new information, we knew we had to do something. We contacted an expert in the occult. He advised us to perform a cleansing ritual to release the trapped spirits. I was skeptical, but I was also desperate. That night, the morgue felt darker than ever, colder. Laura and I followed the ritual instructions exactly. As soon as we started, the shadows thickened. The whispers turned into shrieks. A crushing presence filled the room, as if every soul trapped in that place had gathered at once. We recited the final words. The air erupted with a scream, a wail of pure despair. It came from everywhere and nowhere. The shadows twisted violently, and then they were gone. The cold vanished. A silence heavier than anything I'd ever felt settled over the morgue. The expert told us the place would take time to heal, but that the worst was over. In the days that followed, the morgue felt different. Not bright, not warm, but lighter, like a great weight had finally been lifted. I stopped having nightmares, but I could never forget what I had seen, what I had felt. I continued my work, but with a new respect for the place I worked in, for its dark, for the secrets buried within its walls. I now know there are things in this world that science can never explain, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I still feel something, not evil, not threatening, just an echo, a whisper of spirits that once haunted this place, but now they are at peace, and so I continue my work, knowing that the line between life and death is thinner than... If you enjoyed these stories, we would love your support with a like or a comment, as it helps us a lot. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we invite you to do so you never miss the best of dark tales of the night. With nothing more to add, thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.